I love this room because it's a little less formal than the other room, and it lends itself to that. And I just want to make a comment. I see some kids coming in tonight, and to me that is absolutely fabulous, because I don't think it's ever too early to expose our kids to opportunities like this. They might not learn much in the moment, but they will recognize that there are answers to the questions that they may have 10 years, 20 years down the road. So, well done, Dirksons. As I begin tonight, I just want to give you a little bit of my orientation to apologetics. Paul, you and I have not talked about this. But years ago, I used to think that apologetics, the purpose of apologetics was to convince unbelievers to come to Christ, to become believers. Over the years, I have changed my understanding of that apologetics, the defense of the Christian faith, it has application to unbelievers, but it really is for us who are followers of Jesus. It's a reminder to us that there are answers. We may not have to have we don't have all the answers. We can't remember all the answers. I don't remember everything I've learned from all the speakers that we've had over the years, but I know that there are answers. And so I know that when there are times of doubt, which happened in my life, did I say that out loud? It's true. Occasionally, that there are answers to these questions of Christian faith. We live in a secular world where we do not see miracles happen every day. And so in the secular world in the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, we are bombarded with notions of naturalism and secularism. And so it's important for us to remind ourselves of the faith that we once first believed, and the confirmation of it with the teaching, the tools of apologetics. How do we come to Christ? It's entirely an act of the Spirit of God. We are born again by the Spirit. And He uses, yes, books and teachers and apologetics, but ultimately it's a work of the Spirit of God. Well, I know you didn't come to hear me tonight. You've all moved forward. I appreciate that. Now let's pray, and we will turn this over to Paul. Father, we thank you. Thank you for the privilege we have of being part of your church, your community of believers. Father, this evening, as we embark on this time together, I ask that you would use the teaching of our brother Paul to confirm in our minds, to erase or begin to remove doubts that do creep into our minds. Help us to have answers for these questions that come to us and in our own minds or from other people. Thank you, Father, for this church. Thank you for the willingness of the leadership of this church to embark on occasions like this and opportunities like this. And so I pray tonight for Paul. I pray your blessing upon him as he teaches us. I pray that you would have your hand of blessing upon him as he goes from here and as he continues to be used for your honor and glory. And so we commit this evening to you and commit him. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Once again tonight, you're invited to ask questions. Text in your questions. I believe it's going to be on the screen. Luke Watson will field those questions after Paul has finished. Would you welcome Paul Chamberlain back to our church?
All right, well, good evening. Thank you again for coming out. It's great to see you all here today. I trust you all had a good day. It's really quite a nice day today. I was expecting a little bit of sunshine. I thought that was forecast. We didn't really get sun, did we? Or at least not very much. It's a little bit more like Abbotsford weather here today. So anyway, thanks for being here. You know, when we talk about issues like we're talking about this whole weekend, about the existence of God and about faith and about Jesus and about the Bible, are we not talking about issues that have to do with the meaning of life, with what gives life meaning? I mean, that's really what this all comes down to. Some people think there's no meaning out there at all. Others think they can find it different ways. But if you're a person if you find yourself in a situation where you don't think there's any meaning in life, well, that can be pretty bad. I heard a story one day of a police officer who was called to the scene of a very, very high bridge. He said, there's a man up there threatening to jump off the bridge, and you need to go attend to that situation. So they sealed off the bridge. The police officer went to the bridge, and he drove up to it, got out of his car, walked over, and sure enough, there was the man up there. And the police officer walked closer and closer and closer, and pretty soon the man said, don't come any closer. The police officer said, well, what are you doing up there? Why are you threatening to jump off this bridge? And the man said, there's no meaning in life. I'm going to jump off. And the police officer, was being quite resourceful, said, listen, I've got a plan for you. Before you jump off that bridge, here's my plan. Could you give me 10 minutes to tell you, well, first of all, he said, I will give you 10 minutes to tell you why you think life is not worth living. When you're done, you give me 10 minutes to tell you why I think it is. Well, as the story goes, 20 minutes later, they joined hands and both jumped off the bridge, okay? Well, see, that's how that case went. I hope it doesn't go that way for us very often. But that's what can happen when you try to make a case. It doesn't always go quite the way you wish it was going to go. Well, what we're concerned about here today is why believe in Jesus, the Jesus of Christianity, with all the other options out there. And we've talked about this a little bit all the way throughout the weekend. And that's what we want to get ourselves into here today. And really, when we talk about Jesus, is it not true we're talking about the distinguishing feature of Christianity? I mean, here's what I mean by that. It's one thing to be religious, isn't it? You can be religious and not be a Christian, obviously. Is that not correct? Okay. It's even another thing to believe in God. You can do that too and not be a Christian, correct? You can be a different kind of theist and not be a Christian. Christians are people who believe really in two great convictions, as theologians and Christian philosophers put it. The first is that there is a God, a personal creator God who stands behind everything else that exists. An omniscient God, omnipotent God, a God who's all-powerful, a God who can do all things, a God who is omnipresent. He is everywhere at all times. He's a God who is holy, he is just, he is loving, he is merciful. That's the God Christians believe in. But that's not enough, is it? Christians also believe that this God revealed himself in the person of Jesus, who was a God-man born of a virgin in Bethlehem. In fact, Christians really believe a number of striking things about Jesus when you think about it. We as Christians believe he was not merely human, but he was divine. Divine, human at the same time, a dual nature. Christians believe Jesus was born of a virgin. Who ever heard of such a thing? Born of a virgin. That's what Joseph was called upon to believe, according to the book of Matthew. That Jesus went about performing miracles, we believe that too. We believe he claimed to be the Son of God, the divine Son of God. We believe he claimed to be able to forgive sins of people. He accepted worship from other people. These were the things that got him executed for blasphemy. And when you read the text, you find Jesus never correcting those impressions either. He never said, no, I didn't actually say it that way. I didn't actually mean that. No, he let those impressions stand just as they were. And then, of course, we also believe as Christians that Jesus rose again from the dead in confirmation of his radical claims. As Paul said in Romans chapter 1, verse 4. Most of us here probably know that through the resurrection, God powerfully declared Jesus to be the Son of God. And the point of that verse, I think, is a very powerful verse. Because the point of it is that the God who was supposedly blasphemed by Jesus' claims brought him back to life. To make the point about as dramatically as one ever could, that Jesus was right and his accusers were wrong. Jesus was and is who he claimed to be. That's the whole story we all believe, isn't it? And it's an amazing story, but the question is, where do we get all that from? We get that from the New Testament. Is that not correct? Virtually everything I told you comes out of the New Testament, which raises a really, really big question, and that is this. Can we or should we trust in the New Testament records which give us this story? Because that's where it comes from. And you see, it's sometimes asserted that the New Testament records aren't reliable. And there's various ways people go about making that case, and we're going to talk about a few of them here today. And there are a number of reasons, a number of ways people go about that. But one of those, the one I want to begin with here tonight, is that the gospel accounts we have of Jesus are really legends which developed over a long period of time. They weren't written down early by the actual disciples who we think wrote them. They were legends. They were the result of legendary embellishment, which developed over a long period of time. And then were only written down much later, with all these ideas we talked about here being thought up later and then put back into the mouth of Jesus or his disciples later on. And that's a very common theory that's out there. So let's start there, right, and just ask, how do you figure that kind of thing out? How would you ever assess a claim like that the New Testament is the result of long-term legendary embellishment? Is there a way of looking at documents and getting help on that? Well, what we're going to end up doing here today is looking at a number of reasons to trust the New Testament documents which give us the story about Jesus. And the first one is, and you'll see it up on the screen here, that it's going to address what we just talked about here, the legendary embellishment issue, and is this, that the Gospels were written too early to be legends which developed over time. Let's keep that in mind. This is the first reason I want to get to. The Gospels were written too early to be legends which developed over time. Now, how do you, that's the statement I want to make. How do you support a thing like that? Well, let me just ask this question. It's a little bit of an exercise we can do together. We'll just do this all together. How much time do you think it takes, or it would take, after the events about actual people happened, for fabrications or legends about those events to develop and be accepted as true regarding actual historical figures? You see what I'm saying here? How much time do you think it would take for legends to develop about actual people, and then after those people had long gone, much time would it take for legends to develop and be actually regarded as true about actual historical figures? How long do you think that would take? How about one generation? What if we waited 30 years? Could you have legends like that develop? See, for example, let's think of it this way. Think of somebody you know, maybe a minister you used to know who maybe died 40 or 50 years ago, somebody who was a very godly person. Imagine that after this person died, stories began to develop about this person and became widely accepted after the pastor had died. Stories like this, that when he was alive, he actually walked about healing people, he raised the occasional person from the dead, he claimed to be a prophet of God with supernatural power, a special divine revelation, and ultimately, in the end, he actually rose from the dead. Suppose that never happened, but stories like that began to arise and became widely accepted as true. How long would that take for those to be widely accepted as true? What do you think? What if you waited 30 years? Could that happen in 30 years? I doubt it, could it? Because there'd be too many people sitting right there who were there. So that's one generation. How about two generations, 60 years? Is it possible that ideas like that could become widely accepted? See, think of what has to happen here. You got to wipe out the memory of the hard original facts and replace them with new ones, which, as I say, become widely accepted about actual historical people. Do you think that could happen in two generations? 60 years? Well, you'd still have some people around, wouldn't you, who were there before? And of course, you'd have a lot of next generation people. How about 90 years? 3 generations. What about that? Is that possible? That could be. I can't really see you as well as you can see me, so I'm not sure if you're nodding your heads one way or the other. Let's say that it could happen in 90 years. There's actually a scholar. His name is A.N. Sherwin White. Some of you may have heard his name. He's actually looked into this in a big way, and his name's always quoted on this point because he suggests that it would take somewhere between 90 and 120 years as a bare minimum for this kind of thing to happen, for new stories to arise and become widely accepted about actual historical people. You might have the occasional person here or there believing something, but how about them becoming widely accepted? Let's think about that. If it was 90 years, you know what that would mean about the dating for the New Testament? It would mean that the New Testament would have to have been written somewhere between AD 120 and 150, wouldn't it? That would be about 90 years to 120 years after Jesus rose from the dead. And for that reason, some scholars used to date the New Testament about that time. And of course, what that would do is then allow them to deny the miracle accounts, deny the resurrection, deny the divinity of Jesus, deny he even ever claimed anything like that, just deny the whole thing, and just say these were ideas that developed later over time, only then were written down and put back into the mouth of Jesus and his disciples. The problem is with that is that when you look at the evidence we have, it does not support that later dating. I wonder if you've ever looked at the books like that we have in the New Testament or any other books anywhere and asked, how would I figure out when this was written? We do this in some kind of offhand way from time to time with different reasons, but think about this. Let's take the book of Acts, for example. Have you ever looked at the book of Acts and said, when might the book of Acts have been written? Like, how do we know? Does anything within the book of Acts indicate when it was written? Anybody ever done that kind of thinking just for your interest's sake? It's an interesting little exercise. Well, by way of illustration, Let's suppose that, so let's say 400 years from now, historians or archaeologists discovered some document dealing with terrorism, okay? And it was written it was somewhere back in our time. They knew that, but they were trying to pinpoint the date. So they began to examine the document very, very carefully. And they found lists of key figures, key incidents in the theme of terrorism there. They saw a record of suicide bombings in Israel. They saw car bombings elsewhere. 9/11 was actually in there as well, let's say. But what wasn't, and Osama bin Laden was in there, but as they read the document, they found out there's no mention of the Charlie Hebdo massacre. You remember that one in France? There's no mention of the Boston Marathon bombing. No mention of the bombing even Bali, Indonesia, that happened in 2002. Some of you may remember that. A couple hundred people were killed just in a year after 9/11. These were not mentioned. If that was the case, when do you think we would date that document? When do you think we would decide that document had been written? Probably after 9/11 and before the Bali, Indonesia bombing, don't you think? So it'd be right in there somewhere, pretty careful dating. Now, it's not an exact science. We don't know for sure. Someone might say, well, maybe they had a reason for not mentioning that, but in the absence of some really good reason, that's almost for sure when that would be dated. Well, how about the book of Acts? Here's the thing about the book of Acts. It makes no mention whatsoever of a few significant, well-known historical events which occurred between 60 and 70 AD. And you know what some of those were? I think they'll come up on the screen. The destruction of Jerusalem. When did that happen? AD what? Do we know? AD 70. We know that. That's not mentioned in the book of Acts, if you'll recall. The persecution of Christians by Nero. Remember that? Somewhere between 60 and 70 AD. Not mentioned in the book of Acts. The death of James. The death of Paul. These all happened right around there between 60 and 70 AD. Neither of those are mentioned as well. Now you have to ask yourself this question. Why not mention these in the very book which maps out the early history and actions of the early Christians? Well, the only reasonable explanation I can think of, as most scholars can think of today, is that they had not happened yet when the book of Acts was written, which gives us reason to think that the book of Acts would have been written sometime before AD 70, fairly early. Now, that means then that the book of Luke, which is part one of the Luke-Acts duo, would have been written even before the book of Acts, right? And how about the book of Mark, which almost all scholars agree was the source Luke used? It was the first gospel written. That was earlier even yet. So we're pushing ourselves back maybe to the early 60s. We don't know. Some people think the late 50s, somewhere in there. But the point is, these New Testament books were written way too early for legends to develop and become widely believed. And this, in my mind, is a really key idea. Because if you have these documents written very early, they're close to the source. There's no time for that kind of legendary embellishment. It basically rules out that whole idea that they could be the result of legendary embellishment. They were simply written way too early for that. Well, listen, that's the first reason I want to put on the table here tonight, and we can think about it later on as well, for why we can trust what the New Testament says. One reason is because it was simply written way too early to be the result of a legendary embellishment. Now, let me move on to a second one, because perhaps that's not the only way to think of it. Maybe the New Testament was not written by people who tried to get it right, but they got it wrong because legends had grown up. Maybe that's not it at all. Maybe the writers of the New Testament, and this is another theory altogether, didn't believe what they wrote at all. Maybe they intentionally fabricated what they wrote, the stories in the New Testament. That whoever wrote it down made up the stories, and that's what's there. Okay, but the earliest disciples and apostles, they wrote them down, they made up these stories. Well, what do we think about that? How many of you have heard of this kind of thing before? The idea that maybe these stories are simply invented, made up, they're fabricated. It's an interesting one because I find that not many scholars actually accept this anymore. They find way too many problems with it, but I still hear it out there in the general public that maybe this is just not trustworthy stuff, maybe people made it up. Well, let me just throw out real quickly here 4 problems with this fabrication theory that we can think about. The first is this. I see it as really a very implausible kind of scenario, because here the question you have to ask is this. Suppose you and I were going to fabricate a new set of false ideas which we hoped people would believe, okay? We knew they were false. We're going to make the whole thing up because we want people to believe it. If that was the case, don't you think we would invent ideas which were at least plausible and fairly easy to accept? Well, think of the story that the disciples supposedly invented. The story of a man who claimed to be divine. He could forgive sins. He claimed equality with God, accepted worship. He was killed, and he rose from the dead. Then he lifted off to heaven. We don't see him anymore. None of this ever happened at all, but you invented that whole thing. It seems to me that's highly implausible, very difficult to believe. It does not seem like the type of thing you'd invent if you were hoping people would believe it. But that's not all. Worse than that, they taught that Jesus, someone whom they knew to be a mere human being, was actually God, who died and then didn't stay dead. That's blasphemous to Jewish ears. Because let's not forget that these disciples and their friends and their countrymen were all devoted Jewish monotheists. They were convinced Jewish monotheists. So here they are making up a story about someone who they knew to be a mere man, telling everybody he was God. Completely blasphemous as far as in their thinking. Thirdly, there's even more to that. This kind of fabrication would be a rather foolish, kind of an irrational, senseless kind of fabrication in another way, because you have to ask the question, what did they gain from this kind of, from making up this blasphemous, implausible idea? Remember, being Jewish monotheist, teaching that Jesus, a mere man who was God, was jeopardizing their own standing with God. Furthermore, you have to ask, what did it gain them in this life? Did it gain them popularity? Did it gain them wealth? Did it gain them the good life? The answer is, you know what it gained them, don't you? It gained them persecution and eventually death in many of their cases. And we're going to come talk about that a little bit later. You have to ask, why would you invent this if that's all you got out of it? And then there's one more problem with the fabrication idea, and it's this. The fabrication theory assumes too much. It assumes that the disciples made up the whole story, knew the whole thing was false, held the conspiracy together in the face of hardship and death with no one breaking rank. Does anybody remember watching the Watergate story way back in those days? Anybody here watch that? That was about the time I was just beginning to watch the news a little bit. And since then, I've learned a lot more about it. But think of what this fabrication theory assumes here, that these disciples held this whole story together, no one breaking rank, and went to their death for it. Remember the Watergate story? There was about 3 or 4 really key, what they call hatchet men for Richard Nixon, the president at the time. Names like John Dean, John Ehrlichman, John Haldeman. Remember these names? I think John Mitchell. And the story, as Chuck Colson tells it, they all got together. And they said, we need to get our story straight because the police are going to be coming. And if we can keep our story straight, we can keep ourselves out of jail. Now, they weren't facing death or anything like that. They were facing possible imprisonment. And so they put a story together, and they said, we need to keep this together, and we'll stay out of prison. Well, guess how long they were able to keep that together? Anybody know? 2 weeks. Not 2 years or 2 decades, 2 weeks. When John Dean was taken down by the police, interrogated, broke, spilled the beans, the whole thing was over, the others had to then fess up as well. It lasted 2 weeks, and they were facing imprisonment. We're saying here in this fabrication theory, they made up the entire story, held it together for life, with no one breaking rank and going to their death for it. So my point is here, this one assumes too much. I think the fabrication theory, for good reason, is really not held by very many scholars. Well, let me go to a third reason here, and it's this, that the New Testament, but let me put it this way, it looks reliable, or let's say it passes what I'll call the internal test of reliability. Now, what in the world am I getting at when I say that? Well, this to me is a very interesting one, and this one in one sense has more plausibility than almost any of the other objections people could raise. What I'm getting at is this. It is sometimes asserted, and I wouldn't mind seeing if some of you have heard this one as well, sometimes asserted that maybe it was not that the writers of the New Testament intentionally fabricated the story. Maybe that's not the case at all. Maybe it's this. The problem was that they were too close to Jesus. Anybody heard that before? Maybe the story is they were believers in Jesus, they were his devoted followers, and therefore, how in the world would we ever expect them to be objective? They weren't objective, they were biased. Have you thought about that before? I've had students raise that for me. And they don't raise it by someone, they don't come and say, well, here's what I've heard somebody raise to me. They're raising it themselves. And they're saying, how can we trust what the New Testament authors say? They were all devoted followers of Jesus. How do we think they were going to give us an objective report? What do you think about that? Does that seem like a fair objection? Well, if you write it off too soon, they'll come with an illustration, maybe something like this. People who raise this objection. They'll say, let me give it to you. Suppose I came to you. And I said, really interesting study was just released. I read about this study last week. It's a study about the effects of smoking tobacco, smoking cigarettes. And the study is quite radical. It has some new conclusions. The conclusion of this study is that tobacco smoking is not harmful to one's health. It's a brand new study just out. What's the first question you're probably going to want to ask me? Anybody? What would you say? Did I hear somebody say who did the study? Who commissioned the study? Anybody else thinking that? Well, suppose you ask me that and I say, that's not that important. Okay, what's important surely is the methods of the study and what the conclusions in that. I don't think we need to worry about that. What are you going to say? You're going to push a bit harder, aren't you? You're going to say, no, I really want to know who commissioned this study. And I might be able to hold off for a couple of minutes, and finally you're going to say, come on, Chamberlain, tell us who's behind this study? And then finally, what if I finally say, okay, well, I'll tell you then. The tobacco companies got together, they put the money together, and they commissioned this study. And what are you going to say? Of course it concludes that, right? They have a vested interest. They need that result. They managed to get a study that said that. That's why the study says that. And how much respect will you have for the study at that point? Not that much. That's what's going on here. People come with the same kind of reasoning about the New Testament, and they say, when you tell all these stories about Jesus, first question out of their mouth is, who wrote down those stories? We say, well, Jesus' followers. Were they fairly devoted to him? Yeah, they were so devoted they were willing to die for him. So they were his followers, people who believed in him. Those are the sources we have for these stories. How do you think they're possibly objective? They're biased. Can you see the objection? Can I just have you take a moment with people around you for a second and say, what would you say if that objection came your way? Some of you, I'm sure, have heard it already. How would we respond? Is there anything we have to say by way of this? Because this cuts at the heart of whether we can trust what the New Testament authors say. Even if we believe it was written early and by the earliest apostles, this still cuts at the heart of it and says we still can't trust what they say because they were obviously too close. Just like those tobacco companies were too close and had a vested interest, so did these. They were too close and they had a vested interest as well. What kind of response could we give? Just take 4 minutes with people around you. What do we have to say about that? Thanks. Okay, can I have your attention here? I wouldn't mind hearing what some of us have to say about this, because to tell you the truth, I find this objection probably one of the more plausible ones that I've heard, and I think we need to think it through as carefully as we can. What are we thinking about this? Here, the objection is related to something that is kind of a little bit intuitive to us, really. Has anyone ever said this to you when you're discussing some fairly important issue and it's important to you, and has anyone ever said to you, listen, I think you're too close to this issue? Have you ever said that to anybody else? I think you're a little bit too close to this issue. What are they saying? You're too involved. You're too close. You're lacking objectivity here because you're too close. Okay, so we all understand the idea, the reality of being too close to something to the point where we may be sincere, we may be committed, we may really believe the thing. There's no problem with any of that. It's just that we're so close that we lack some objectivity, and maybe we start saying things that aren't quite accurate, but we don't really know that because we're just too close. That's what it's all about. What do we say by way? If someone presents that to us and says, this is why I have trouble accepting what the New Testament says, what do we say? Anybody here? I wouldn't mind hearing from a few.
You have to look for external support.
Okay, so look for something external. Okay, so going beyond what the New Testament says, find some other extra biblical sources, you mean?
Maybe, but also look at historical evidence for Christ's life.
Okay.
His death, for his resurrection.
Okay, sure.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah.
Something outside of the subjective
Okay.
perspective.
Okay. So to make a full-orbed case, that's a really good point. Full-orbed case. Is there anything else we can look to that would be supporting of this? Other reasons to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, other than just that we read them here, let's say, something like that. That's good. I think that's a very good point there. Anybody else? Another hand over here? Yes.
You have to look at why the disciples lied about it.
Okay.
So, what would they get out of making up about the story?
Okay.
Nothing, really.
Well, yeah. Now, that's exactly right. Now, of course, the person may say, we don't really think they're lying. We think they're they telling the truth the best they can. It's just that they're so close that they're lacking some objectivity here. That they may have that response for you on that. What you're saying is really true, though. I mean, as far as the thing, if the idea is that they outright lied, you really do have to ask, what do you think they'd get out of doing that?
But then
Okay.
you also have to ask, why does it show the negative sides of the disciples?
Okay.
Where they failed in their faith.
This is a really key point. Do you hear what's being said here? How about the other things in there which are actually a little bit negative toward the disciples or others? This group over here is onto a key idea. Anybody else mention something like that? Yeah, right. There's no problem acknowledging that you have a good idea there, a good point. I'm going to come back to that one, actually. I think, actually, that may be the heart of the answer if we can develop that properly right there. I'm not sure if anybody else mentioned something like that, but this is the other side of it. Anybody else on this? Yes, sir.
Of necessity, eyewitness accounts have to be close,
Okay.
but there's no collusion because they're not perfectly identical stories.
I think I heard that word collusion on the news the other day. Okay. That's where you're getting it from too, I'll bet you. Okay. Okay, there's no collusion because of no. So you're saying if they're going to be eyewitness accounts, they're going to be close. They're going to have to be people who are close to the source, right? Now that's a really interesting way to put that. So the question then becomes, so what do you want? Do you want somebody to write these stories down who's far enough back that they could not have any objectivity, they could not be close at all, but then now you're losing an eyewitness account. Is that, would you prefer that? And you're saying there's another reason to I think you have 2 points there. To say if there's collusion, okay, that's a little bit of a different point, but you're saying at least we're looking at 3 or 4 different accounts, which have some differences among them as well. They really do. Now, it's a little different point there than the lacking of objectivity, but it's still a good point to raise. Because the fact that there's some differences, sometimes called a synoptic problem, is in my mind not a problem at all. I think it's a fantastic thing. The differences you find between the Gospels, because that means there was not collusion. If there would have been collusion, they would all say the same thing word for word, which they don't. Okay? So that's an interesting one to bring a little bit bigger picture to it. Anybody else? We're getting some really good, thoughtful points here. Yes, right there.
Because there's a lot of miraculous accounts,
Mm-hmm.
they are so close to him, it would be hard for him to fake those kind of things around them.
It would be hard to,
For Jesus, so because there were so many miraculous accounts,
yeah.
because they were so close to them, even if it wasn't real, someone would be able to see through them.
Oh, I see. Okay, so if it was so lacking enough objectivity to be really giving us a false report, you're saying there's enough other people around who could tell us, and we actually do have 4 different Gospels here as well, not just one. Okay, that's good. I think that's a good point there. So it's not just one person who we could say maybe lacked objectivity. There's other people here as well. Yeah, good. Other sources. Okay, these are very thoughtful. I'm not sure, I don't want to miss anybody if there's anybody else who has a comment here. Let me tell you where I'm going with this, and it's related very much to a number of things that were said here today. See, so the objection is they were simply too close. And so they were lack objectivity and end up being biased. Well, here's the point with that, is that there's a flip side to that objection, and I've heard it from over this side and this side as well together. The flip side of that objection, namely that the disciples were too close to Jesus and therefore biased, is this, that being as close as they were also gave them what? It gave them privileged access to information other people would never have. You see what I'm saying? So if they were too close, and that's why we say they lack objectivity, being too close also means they had privileged access. They spent time with Jesus. They spent 3 years with him, walking with him during the day, hearing him speak and tell the same stories again and again and again. And then spending time in the evening and debriefing, and then going out and doing it the next day, and the next day for 3 full years. You know the kind of insight, any kind of access they would have to information? Now we might say, well, yeah, they became his followers, so we're wondering if they could be objective. But the flip side of this is they had phenomenal access to information. Which, by the way, is a very strong point in favor of historical reliability. You see what we're saying here? So on the one hand, we can say, well, we have the question of objectivity, and let's say that's a detractor from reliability. On the other hand, the very same thing means they also had privileged access to information, which is a strong point in favor of reliability. So you have these two. And what I mean by this is, just imagine if you were wanting to get information on some other public figure, maybe a president or a prime minister or somebody like that. And you had two options to get it from. One person who had been, let's say, a press reporter, and they showed up every 2 or 3 weeks for a press conference, and they sat in the press gallery, and they asked some questions. They did that for 2 or 3 years, asking questions here. They finally wrote a book about it. And then eventually another book comes out. This one's written by an actual aide to the person, to the president or prime minister, who spent 3 years with that person on the road, planning the schedule, hearing the talks, telling all the information. My question is, which book would you buy? What do you think about that? Which one would you want? Well, you may want to say, maybe I'd get both. Maybe that's not a bad idea. But I'll bet you if you could only afford one, most of us would want the one written by the person who was really close to the president or to the prime minister, whoever it may be. Why? Because we're going to get insight and access to information that we would never, ever get any other way. And we might say to ourselves, yeah, maybe this person's going to be a little bit biased because they probably really love this person, probably really devoted to that person. Maybe we're going to wonder about that. But we are going to get very careful, a great insight, privileged access to information. So here you got these two. You got maybe the question of objectivity, and you got access to information, phenomenal access to information. And then it makes you wonder, now, how do we balance those two? What do we do with those? Well, I think it comes to this question here. And it comes to something that was said over here. The question then becomes this. When we look at what was actually written in those Gospels, does what was written does it appear to have been written by people who were willing to tell the truth, warts and all? You see what I'm saying? Does it look like it was written by people who were really were willing to tell the truth, warts and all? Or does it look like a real one-sided, biased picture? And I think that the answer is, yes, it does look like it was written by people who are willing to tell the truth, warts and all. And there's a number of indicators about this. And the first is this, that when you look at the picture of the Gospels, of the disciples in those 4 Gospels, it is not always a flattering picture, is it? I mean, think of some of the things you read in there. You know, Peter. Okay, we all know about Peter. Kind of a number of funny stories about Peter. But he's the one who jumped into the water when he saw Jesus walking on the water. You got to give him a little bit of credit for that, don't you? But then he gets out to where Jesus is, and he sank because he had no faith. And Jesus just said, hey, where's your faith? You have little faith, okay? Well, then Peter's the same person who went on later on and promised Jesus the moon. He said, I'll give my life for you. Jesus said, you're actually going to deny me. And what did Peter say? Never. He was adamant, I will never deny you. Next thing he's doing is pulling out a sword and cutting off the guard's ear when they came for Jesus, a little out of control there. Okay, remember the name of the guard who's got his ear cut off? Anybody know the name? Malchus. I heard Stuart Briscoe say one time, Pastor Stuart Briscoe, when Peter pulled out that sword, he wasn't aiming for his ear. He was trying to get Mal on one side and cuss on the other. Is how Stuart Briscoe put it. But he had been out of practice and he was a bad shot, and he just got the ear cut off, and Jesus had to take the ear and put it back on for the poor guy, which he did, put the ear back on, but that's what Peter did. But the next thing Peter's doing after that is denying he ever knew Jesus 3 times in a row and cussing and swearing to make his point. The thing is not sugar-coated, is it? But that's not all. How about Thomas? Thomas was the guy who doubted Jesus rose from the dead until he was absolutely forced to believe. I don't mean forced physically, but forced rationally to believe. He would not believe until Jesus was standing right in front of him and saying, look, here's the wound on my side, here's the marks in my hands. How are you not going to believe? That's what it took for Thomas to believe. Then here's my favorite one. You have the other disciples arguing one day. Remember this story? And Jesus walks into the room. Remember this? And suddenly everything went quiet. Jesus walks in and says, what were you guys talking about? No one said a word. You know why? Because then the author says what they had been talking about was they had been arguing about who would be what? The greatest in the future kingdom. That's what their argument was about. I'd find that embarrassing if I had been a part of that group. But there they were in there. And then, of course, it still goes on. When Jesus died and the women went to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, where were the disciples, the spiritual giants? What were they doing? They were hiding out in fear. refusing to believe Jesus even rose from the dead, even when the women told them. They would not believe it. I mean, the point is, this is not a flattering picture. It seems to me to be a realistic picture. So before we say, I don't think you can accept this because it's going to be biased, we'll find out just how biased it really is. It appears, at least on in one sense here, one set of reasons, that they were willing to tell the whole truth. There's another reason, I say, why it passes the internal test, and that is that there were the use of women as witnesses to the empty tomb. And you've probably heard about this in the past, but this is another key internal indicator of authenticity, because in that culture, as we probably all know, the status of women was what? It was very low, wasn't it? A little bit like servants or maybe children. They were not given education the same as men were. Women's credibility was considered to be quite low in that culture. Oftentimes, very often, their testimony was not even accepted in court. So if the only witness you had to support what you had to say was female, you were in tough shape. Here's the question: if you were going to fabricate a story, an astounding story like this, which you hoped people would believe, would you choose women as the only witnesses to it? No, especially when men were available. No, you would not. You would choose men. You would choose the disciples. But when you read the story, the witnesses we have to the empty tomb and the tomb with Jesus in it were all women, the primary witnesses. Thirdly, the third indicator I want to simply point out here is the use of Joseph of Arimathea in the burial story. Remember that little part of the story in Mark chapter 15? Remember Joseph of Arimathea was a person who says he was a key member, an important member, prominent member of the Sanhedrin, 71 men, a ruling council of the Jews. And here was Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member. He's the one who came to Pilate and said, could I have the body of Jesus and I'll bury him in my tomb? Put him there. Well, you have to ask the question, suppose that didn't happen. Would you invent a person and just give him a name, Joseph of Arimathea, put him on the Sanhedrin in your story if he never was? I don't think you would. It'd be so easy to verify, check that out. Or would you take a person who was actually on the Sanhedrin and say he's the one who did it if he never did it? Again, way too easy to verify or to check out that account. These are all indicators of authenticity. So I guess I would just say the point we want to make here is that when you look at it all said and done, it seems to me that the New Testament ends up looking very reliable. It passes an internal test. There's one last reason I want to get to here, a fourth one to turn our attention to, when it comes to reasons to believe the Jesus of Christianity. And that is this. Let me just put it this way. There is good reason to believe Jesus rose from the dead. There's good reason to believe he rose from the dead. And of course, if that happened, then the rest of Christianity simply follows right on through. Now, I guess we might as well just admit, maybe you've thought about this, maybe you haven't, but we might as well just admit that in the 21st century in which you and I live, the idea of a person dying, then coming back to life, it's not the easiest idea for people to get their minds around, is it? It never was really an easy idea for people to get their minds around. Because there's two things we thought we knew for certain. What are those two things? Death is one, and what's the other one? Taxes. Two things we know for certain, we thought. So here are Christians going around saying their leader, their founder, Jesus, rose from the dead. How do we get off making that kind of a claim? Why would we think anybody would accept that? Well, before we answer it, let's also realize that the resurrection of Jesus is a teaching which Christianity has been bringing to the world for 2,000 years now. We're not doing anything new. And the teaching is just this. After Jesus was crucified on a Roman cross for blasphemy, that's what the charge was, God raised Jesus from the dead to a brand new kind of life. In other words, it wasn't a resuscitation to the same life he had before, like, say, in the case of Lazarus, let's say, in John chapter 11. It wasn't that at all. It was a resurrection to a new kind of life, sometimes called resurrection life, or eternal life, which would never end, which is no longer subject to disease, or suffering, or pain, or death. Now, I guess we can ask, why is this so important? Well, it's important because this becomes the basis for our own hope, that once we attach ourselves to Jesus, he passes on to us this same resurrection life. And death no longer has the final word for us either. Death has been conquered. In other words, this teaching of the resurrection is so special, so important, because it's the answer to something that is so horrible, and that is death. And of course, what makes death so horrible? Well, you and I all know. It's final. That's what stings about it. It's irreversible. And I don't mean final or irreversible in some relative sense of being more final or more irreversible than something else. No, death is absolutely final, absolutely irreversible. There's no coming back. And that's why it stings, and that's why we cry when death occurs. Here is precisely the point I want to get right here. Here is precisely where Christianity speaks into the situation. And it tells us something that's really incredible, really fantastic, really spellbinding, really. And that is that this life and this death that we will all experience in some time in the future is not, in fact, the end. The irreversible has actually been reversed. What was final has been definalized, if I can invent a word. Which means, of course, that Christianity offers one of the most hopeful ideas in the entire world of ideas. When what Christianity says, in fact, sometimes I found it to be so fantastic, so amazing, some critics just laugh and say, well, of course, that's too good to be true. That's just pie in the sky. Who wouldn't want to believe that? Well, I guess I would just say, notice what's being admitted in comments like that. What's being admitted is that what Christianity is saying here is a great message, if only it were true. So I guess I would just say, before you write it off, before you turn down that offer, let's at least check out the evidence for it. Do yourself the favor of checking out the evidence for it. And here's a key point for us. This hope that we have all rests on Jesus' own resurrection from the dead. And of course, you know what that means, don't you? That means that if Jesus did not rise from the dead, it means all of our hope is lost as well. And Paul basically says so, as much in 1 Corinthians 15. So we're back to this question. Why would we believe this amazing teaching that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, let me give a couple comments by way of response to this, a couple answers to make a couple of points. The first one is this. Virtually everybody who examines the issue agrees that the earliest disciples believed, with me here, believed Jesus rose from the dead, despite having powerful reason not to. In fact, think with me for a moment of the reasons the disciples had for not believing Jesus rose from the dead. They would have had some powerful reasons not to believe this thing. In other words, I think we can see why it would have been a difficult thing for them to accept. What are some of those reasons? Well, the first one is the same reason we all have. For them too, death was final. When you're dead, you stay dead. They knew that as well as we do. But however, second reason, in the early disciples' case, they had some extra reasons for finding this idea difficult. They were Jews. The Jewish people had no concept of a dying, much less rising Messiah. I wonder if we could put ourselves in the shoes of the Jews at that time. Because as far as they were concerned, the Messiah was the person who was supposed to throw off the Romans, to reestablish the powerful Davidic government. He was not supposed to die some ignominious death at the hands of the Romans. It was just a blatant case of dashed expectations. But you see, even the Jews who did believe in the resurrection, like Pharisees, for let's say, the Sadducees did not, the Pharisees did, some others did as well. But when you did believe in the resurrection, you believe, first of all, it would be a general resurrection at the end of the world, and it would be for all of God's people. The idea of one individual coming to new life before the end of the world did not fit any of their expectations whatsoever. So Jesus' resurrection did not fit their expectations either. That would have been another reason, but they would have had a tough time believing it. But then there's a third reason, which I bet most of us haven't thought about that much, which would make it really difficult for these disciples to have believed Jesus rose from the dead, and that is this. According to Jewish law, you can check this out sometime. It's in Deuteronomy 21:21. Okay? Jesus' execution would have led them to believe he was, can anybody finish that sentence for me? He was what? A criminal, a heretic, accursed by God. I think I heard the word out there. It says there, he who hangs on a tree is cursed by God. Cursed is he who hangs on a tree. Deuteronomy 21:21. It's quoted in the New Testament as well. Which means that Jesus' execution would have led them to think that the Pharisees had been right all along. I mean, can you just imagine the rotten weekend these guys would have been having, trying to figure out what went wrong? How do we make sense out of any of this stuff for the past 3 years at the end of this whole thing? So then, when they're presented with the idea that Jesus is alive, no wonder it was a shock to them. No wonder it was a surprise. But here's the idea, the point of question I want to ask. With all these reasons, these factors, making it hard for the first disciples to believe he rose, why did they believe it? And why did they persist in believing it up to the point of suffering and death for their claim? Because here's the point. Almost everybody, scholars of all stripe, accept the idea that they believed. They thought he rose from the dead. Many people will deny he did rise, But almost nobody denies that these disciples believed it. They thought he did. Why? Why would they believe it? And it leads me to the second point I want to make here, and that is just this. And the answer is really quite simple. The earliest disciples, apostles, were in a different position than any of the rest of us, weren't they? They believed it for a very simple reason, because they claimed that they had personally seen Jesus alive after he was publicly crucified in Jerusalem. You see what I'm saying? So to try to go to these guys and say, Jesus didn't rise, they had a very quick answer. You know what their answer was? No, you're wrong. We've seen him. We've seen him alive. We know he rose. We saw him. You may not have seen him, but we did. That was their answer. And they're willing to go to their death for it. That's why they believed it. And by the way, as I say, virtually no one doubts that they claimed they had seen the risen Jesus, but they believed he'd risen from the dead. But the real question is this. The question for us is, we know why they claimed to believe it. I mean, why they went ahead and believed it, because they said they saw him. Real question for us is this. Why should we believe their claim is true? How about that question? Why should we believe it? Let me give you this answer, and tell me what you think of this answer. We should believe it because these same disciples were willing to die for this claim. Okay? We should believe it because these same disciples were willing to die for it. According to the best traditions we have, Andrew, Peter, and Philip were crucified. Bartholomew was whipped to death. James the Just, Jesus' brother, thrown off the top of the Jerusalem temple, subsequently beaten to death. James the Greater and Paul were beheaded. John Mark was road-hauled. Luke was hung. In other words, the point is they were very clearly willing to die painful deaths for their claim that they had seen the risen Jesus. Okay? But some of you may be surprised my answer. My answer here is, why should we believe their claim is true? Because they were willing to die. Some of you may be saying to yourself, well, so what does a martyrdom prove? And let's just ask that question. Does the fact that a person was martyred for what they believe prove the belief was true? What's the answer to that? Pretty interesting, isn't it? It's pretty hard to see how it would. I mean, we all know that it would prove that they were deeply sincere about their belief. There's no doubt about that. But of course, we all also know it's possible to be sincerely wrong. So then why am I saying here today that in the disciples' case, their willingness to die for their claim gives us powerful reason to believe their claim was true? Well, this was brought to me by two very well-known scholars, Gary Habermas, who I believe was here some time back, and a colleague of his and a friend of mine as well, Michael Licona, who wrote a great big book on the resurrection, or a good-sized book, and Michael Licona himself wrote another big one on the resurrection. Here's the point they make, and it's a very interesting one. I want to give it here tonight. They said this: the disciples' martyrdoms were different than most other martyrs. Their martyrdoms were different than all future Christian martyrs. Because here, and notice the difference here, because whereas most martyrs are willing to die for a set of beliefs that they have come to accept as true, that wasn't the case for the disciples. They died for their claim, their testimony, that they had personally seen the risen Jesus alive after he was publicly crucified in Jerusalem. You see the difference here? This is a really interesting point to me. In other words, it's not simply a set of beliefs for which they died. Okay? It was a claim to have personally seen Jesus alive for which they died. That's what they died. And you see, the only question is, was this claim true? Do we have good reason to believe it's true? Well, one thing we know is this: liars make poor martyrs. Would you agree with that? Liars don't make very good martyrs. Because people are not willing to die for something they know to be a lie. Which means this: the disciples were probably not lying. And remember, they all stuck together on this. No one broke rank. No one changed the story right to the end of the line. But think about that. That means then that if they were not lying when they said they saw the risen Jesus, what does that mean? That means they really saw the risen Jesus after he was crucified. And what does that mean? That means Jesus really did rise from the dead. That's what that means. That's the point coming from Habermas and Licona. I think it's a profound, simple one, but yet a very profound one. Because the point is this: virtually no one denies these two ideas, that the disciples believed he rose from the dead, And number two, they were willing to go to their deaths for the claim that they had personally seen the risen Jesus. On the principle that liars make poor martyrs, we have good reason to believe they were telling the truth, and if they were telling the truth, that means they really saw the risen Jesus, which means he really did rise from the dead. It's just like Romans chapter 1, verse 4 says, Paul, and I just want to close with these couple of scriptural statements. Paul said, Jesus was declared to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. So Paul said in Romans 1. And in Acts 17, Paul at Mars Hill in the Areopagus made this statement. God showed us who Jesus was. How? By raising him from the dead. Those are the statements. And I think we have really good reason for believing Jesus rose from the dead. Which means that at the end of the day, even if there's a whole bunch of other questions we have that we can't figure out, if you're convinced Jesus rose from the dead, as Gary Habermas likes to say, the rest of Christianity follows. It follows logically. God raised him from the dead. Thank you very much. Good. Okay, yeah.
All righty, Paul. Check.
Okay, check.
Round 3, Paul. Here we go. And actually, church, I know some of you are now coming in on the questions, so perhaps what we'll do is I'll ask a couple and then we'll just open it up. We're a small group tonight. If you got a question, just put your hand in the air and we'll pass the mic.
Yeah.
Ian, you call the shots on when you want to stop the party up here. Okay, when everybody's gone. Hey, Rob, you like that, Rob? Just to get everybody up to speed here, if you're just joining us tonight, these are all online. Paul has given 3 separate talks, one Sunday morning, one last night at church at 6, and tonight they're all going to be available online, so if you want to catch up with those. And also, Paul has books here, and Paul, maybe you could just talk about those again quickly.
I'm not sure if some of you, if you've been here, maybe you heard this already, but let me just tell you what they're at the back. They'll be taken down tonight. I'll be taking them home with me, whatever's left. Just so we know, can we be good without God? It arose from a debate I was involved in dealing with 2 questions. Is there such a thing as real objective moral truth? And the atheist philosopher I debated on that one, and I both agreed there was. But the second question is, if so, what foundation is necessary? Is God required as a foundation for objective moral truth? And this book goes into that same 2 questions with 5 different views. It's a dialogue back and forth on those. This one, physician-assisted suicide, now called medical assistance in dying, deals with this issue after a number of engagements I had on that question some time back. Talking about good and bad without getting ugly just lays out a number of principles for how to engage others on moral questions and questions of faith as well. Questions like, what do we do when someone says you have no right to impose your moral values on the rest of us? You're religious, we're not. You can hold your view, but you certainly have no right to impose your religious or your moral values on the rest of us. How do we respond to that? Is there a kernel of truth to that, or is there not? If so, how do we, because that can shut down an entire viewpoint without even any further discussion. This book, Why People Don't Believe, deals with the question, is religion, including Christianity, dangerous? Is it a force for evil? It's a response to a group called the New Atheists who argue that religion, including Christianity, is a force for evil. It causes people to fly planes into buildings and do things like that and blow themselves up in suicide bombings and cause all kinds of other havoc in the world. That's what this book's about. And then there's one other one coming out in which we'll take orders for at the back called Why People Stop Believing. That's what this series has been about. But it explores issues further about when people walk away from the faith, what are they saying? Why do they walk away? And how can we prepare ourselves to engage people like that? Because that's an entirely different kind of critic of the faith, and there's a wave of that happening. So they're at the back. Linda Strumsmo is back there tonight. Linda and I, by the way, go back a long, long way. Okay? High school days. We were in high school together in the same classes, social studies together, Linda and I, a whole bunch of them. I'm sure we learned a lot back in those days, but we were there. And so Linda and Ed have always been good friends, and they're managing the book table. Yeah.
Awesome, Paul. All right, Paul, so we'll start. might go here. A question came in about that, but let's start. Number one, somebody sent in a picture that was on an atheist website about all the contradictions that are in the Bible, and how would you respond to that? I kind of looked it up. It looked like some of the contradictions. Here's some of the things they said. There's 2 contradictory creation accounts. Who killed Goliath? Abraham, was he justified by faith and works? So some of these questions we've dealt with in church, but how would you respond to somebody? The Bible is full of contradiction. How could you believe it as true?
Wow. Okay. I mean, that's such a huge. It's an interesting question. It's a huge one, really. When that question comes to me, I normally begin by saying, have we defined a contradiction? Because sometimes things can be different. Like there'll be some text in the Synoptics and where it says there was 1 man here, another parallel account will say there was 2 men here. And people will point to that as a contradiction. Well, let me just say, if there were 2, I can guarantee you there was 1, okay? And there was also another one as well. And we'll say that kind of thing from time to time ourselves. I'll meet with, say, 3 or 4 people in a meeting I have, but I'll come home to Gail and my wife, and I'll say, yeah, I met with Bill today, okay? Because he was the one I wanted to talk to, or that was the point of the conversation my wife and I were having, or something like that. We'll say those kinds of things. So we need to be careful about a contradiction. A contradiction is when 2 ideas really, truly negate each other. They cannot both be true. Now, I'm not saying the Bible doesn't have some difficult points along the way, but issues like, are we justified by faith or by works? Looking at Paul, looking at James, you can actually take these 2 texts and put them side by side and make them appear to be contradictory until you read James further and understand what James is actually doing. James is defining what true faith is. That's what he's doing. And when you understand that, there's absolutely no contradiction whatsoever. James is saying if this so-called faith, you're not justified by that, but by works as well, in the sense that genuine faith will produce those works, indicating that is genuine faith. I really don't see a contradiction there. And I would say that the time it becomes a little dicey is when you look at passages like the differences among the Synoptic Gospels. We referred to that just a bit ago. And some of those can appear to be pretty difficult. Now, I will say, there's been 2,000 years worth of work on the Synoptics. I mean, that's a long, long time. For a long, long time, people have worked on this, and Professor Craig Blomberg, who's written a number of books on this issue, says basically there's not a single suggested contradiction or discrepancy in the Gospels that has not been explored and given some kind of plausible harmonization to. So before we just glibly say the Bible's full of contradictions, we really do need to examine them carefully, and then also, if we're going to be fair, examine the suggested harmonizations to those supposed contradictions and see if we think that they if they work, if they're plausible, if they make sense. Here's what I think. When I look at the Gospels, and I find them not lining up simply and easily together, you know what? I actually am delighted about that. Because when you read historians on multiple sources, they will tell you repeatedly that if you have 2 or 3 multiple sources on the same event, and they all say exactly the same things, you know what that means? What's the word again, my friend? Collusion. That word from the news again, okay? But this is a really key idea. As historians will immediately set those sources aside as basically unhelpful, because not only do they know one simply copied from the other, so at the best you've got one source, but you probably haven't got any good sources, because it means they all sat together and got their story straight. Really interesting story. I just want to take 1 second on this. Jim Wallace is an interesting fellow. He was a homicide detective, Christian man down in Southern California, who went to Talbot Seminary down there, studied apologetics. Now he writes on apologetics, and he brings his policing career to this job. And he talks about this. He said one day he was called to the scene of where a crime had occurred, and they had arrested 3 different people. He said, you need to come down and interrogate these 3 suspects. We have them here at the scene. So he got in his car. He says, it took me an hour to get there. I drove down there. I got there and I said, okay, where are the 3 people I need to interview, to interrogate? He said, well, they're in that police cruiser right over there. He says, what, they're all in the same police cruiser? They said, yeah. How long have they been there? An hour. Jim says, never, ever put them in the same police cruiser. There's no point interviewing them anymore. They've had all the time in the world to get their story straight. At this point, they're unhelpful witnesses. And he said, that's the trouble. When you see witnesses, when you see stories come out that are exactly the same, it's an indication of collusion. When you see sources that have differences, even when and especially when they're kind of hard to put together, It means they're independent testimony, and at the very least, they mean we might end up not knowing what detail may have happened here or there, but the core events of the story are very well established by 2 or 3 sources where there are some differences. And that's what we have to bring to the world. 4 Gospels that give us a set of core events that we have really good reason to believe existed.
Yeah.
And the differences are a positive thing. They're not a negative thing. So I have got no problem with some differences that are difficult to resolve in the Gospels. Long answer.
And Paul, and just to kind of, land us, I mean, not all of us have the mind of you where you could probably rip through all these questions, and there are answers to these questions, right? The contradictory creation account, yeah, boom, heard that one before. Who killed Goliath? Maybe some of us are like, what, David? There's somebody else that's talked, yeah, right? And you're gonna go home and look that up, right? It's almost though, Paul, and I want you to comment on this. We have to be careful when these things, you get into these nitty-picky things. And I think what you talked about is the synoptic gospel. There is a consistent message in the New Testament. I think the early church fathers talked about this, that there's, I think it was the rule of faith. Where there's a consistent
There's a
teaching.
consistent message of the core events. It's consistent and it's quite clear, and they're really well established as well. I mean, it's a phenomenal thing. It just means at the very worst case scenario, there's a few details we wouldn't be sure about. But from what I read from historians, that too is exactly what you'd expect. When 4 people start writing down the events of something that's really blowing their minds, a person dying and then suddenly they're told he's risen from the dead, just doesn't fit our background at all. And you get, as N.T. Wright calls them, the puzzled, hurried accounts of people who are writing things down which are totally unfamiliar to them. And beyond that, I would really encourage us all to examine if there's an individual passage that has what looks like a contradiction to us, examine it carefully and do yourself the favor of looking at the very best suggested harmonization to what that might be and see what you think. Okay? That's probably the best thing we could say. Yeah. Amen,
Paul. This person, again, I'm kind of going to summarize your question. If I don't do it properly, raise your hand and we'll get you to do it yourself. But so what about Mormonism they start with? This is like a modern day version of the first church. It has been a supposed hoax that has been perpetrated in the world and carried on for over 150 years. We can't assume that the leaders of Mormonism are still colluding a hoax, trying to mislead people. They have genuine encounters with God. They have apologetics themselves. How do we talk with them? I mean, you could probably make the same argument for other religions too.
Yeah, I mean, how do we interact with them, or why would this kind of thing be in existence?
Yeah,
I
think what the question's after is they have similar debate that we do.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, to really answer that question very well, it would be wise to talk to people who've explored Mormonism in depth. I mean, there was a time in my life when I did this in quite a lot of detail. Some of you probably in the room have done this in the past as well. I think, number one, the fact that there is true teaching out there, has never ever meant that there could not be false teaching rising up alongside. It just logically, both are possible. So I'm never surprised that there could be some teaching which misses it here or there. It's on some fundamental point. I mean, it just means we need to be very clear on what the truth really is, but that's not a new thing. From the very beginning of the church, they had Gnosticism arise. They had what's called Docetism arise, the idea that Jesus wasn't really human or in flesh, he just seemed to be, And all these different ideas would arise, and that's why they sat down and said, we need to figure out exactly what it means to be a Christian, and they wrote out creeds, Apostles' Creed and Nicene Creed. So I don't see any reason to be surprised that other teachings could arise that are not in conformity with what Jesus taught. I would just say that my very most effective conversations I've ever had with Mormons themselves have revolved around who the person of Joseph Smith is, and do we have reason to believe he was a true prophet. This has been some of the best discussions I've ever had. And you really need to keep on track, because it's possible to go a lot of different ways. But I think we should have a lot of appreciation and care and love for our Mormon friends. And when we get an opportunity to say, without getting into all the other details, the key question here, who was Joseph Smith? Do we have reason to believe he was a true prophet? prophet. Because that's really foundational to me. And I don't see why we wouldn't just head straight for that one. But this question's probably asking more than that. And so,
And Paul, for us too, you know,
Yeah.
that it seems like, again, of course, we've seen very genuine Muslim people, Mormon people who have encountered something.
right.
I've encountered Jesus Christ. That's my subjective experience. However, as you say, we have to move towards the objectivity.
Yeah, right, okay.
And you would push us there in that kind of
Well,
discussion.
no, that's what's interesting about the question. I sometimes with my students, and I wonder whether we should be doing it in the middle of this year without having all the introductory stuff we do with the students, but I raise a question with students when it comes to people who claim to have had experiences with God, okay? It's a very subjective thing. It's some kind of unwieldy. You can't really control it, okay? And sometimes certain Christian traditions would rather stay away from that kind of thing because we can't really control it. We're not really sure what to do. When someone comes and they said, God told me this or God told me that. But the thing is, you can't really write the thing off, can you? Read the Old Testament, the New Testament, God's speaking to people directly all the way through. And do we really want God not to reach down and speak to us? So the question then is, what about a person who's not in a Christian tradition, who claims God spoke to him? Well, this is actually a fairly dicey question. So I guess with my students, I've asked this question. Let's flip that around for just a moment and ask this question. Do we think it's possible that God himself might reach down and make contact with somebody who's not in a Christian tradition or a Christian group or is not a Christian? Not a follower of God at all, the God of the Bible. Is that possible?
Absolutely.
That's possible, at least. So can we just write off every time we ever hear that someone claims God did? The only thing I would say is this. If the God of the Bible is going to reach down and if this really happened and make contact with somebody who's not in a Christian tradition, what I would hope and I would expect, I would pray for, is that person would gradually be led to the person of Jesus. Who God revealed himself in the person of Jesus, that's where the person would be led. And as a matter of fact, there is increasing stories around the world of God doing exactly that with many of our Muslim friends. Many of them are finding God through dreams and through visions and other ways, and they ultimately end up coming to know Jesus in that way. And so I guess we need to be cautious, be very careful, and ultimately in the end, if we return to something objective, like you said, like the Word of God. Yeah.
Amen, Paul. Moving on to kind of something else, kind of a general question for us here. You know, based on your research, the title, Why People Stop Believing, you've talked about this a few times. What have you seen as some of the major, highest reasons why people are leaving the Christian faith?
Well, I mentioned yesterday morning a number of things that I'd come across. I mentioned in some cases they feel like they've been let down by the Christian community. I mean, it's a gradual thing. I see a combination of things. I never see just one thing. And it usually takes some time. And sometimes there's these things going on that are under the surface and we just don't know. But sometimes people have had some bad experiences, maybe feel like they've been let down. In one case I know for sure there's a moral failure. There's way more cases than I know about. But a moral failure and the person finally came back, but then had trouble finding renewed acceptance. And people who he used to have as colleagues didn't know who to believe anymore, okay? He said he found that really, really hurt. And a lot of it, a whole combination of things. One thing I have found, though, is that, and this is troublesome to me, and it's also a little bit complex, and that is that I sometimes wonder what kind of Christianity is it that people are actually walking away from? Because when I've talked to some of them, I find they're walking away from a version of Christianity which says, to be a Christian, you've got to live this narrow way. You've got to believe these very particular things. They're all secondary issues, by the way.
Amen, Paul, yes.
You've got to believe these secondary matters. This is Christianity. This is not our particular tradition or version of it. This is Christianity. And you've got to believe a number of things like that. And they find it very, what's the word? It's suffocating. And they walk away, and I'm thinking to myself, man, I'm not sure. Maybe I would have walked away from that too. I mean, I'm at least glad I was given some freedom to think.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up at PBI. Was I given freedom to think at PBI? Well, actually, my dad was a very open person on this. He sent us all. At PBI, when I went there, they said, don't go to university, you'll lose your faith. And my dad said, forget all about that. Just ignore that. Go to university. All of you go to university. And we all went to university and college. And I thank him to my dying day for doing that. And we come home, and here's the other interesting thing. At PBI in those days, I wasn't counting on talking about this, but I might as well since I'm up here anyway. PBI in those days, L.E. Maxwell was so highly regarded. It was almost like you were really doing something very scary and very nervous, very wrong if you even critiqued, questioned what he had to say. Well, we'd come home from church and my dad would say, Ellie was wrong on that. That was wrong what he said there.
Right.
And even the fact that he would say that would open things up, so I'd say, yeah, Ellie's a great guy, but he's human. He could be wrong too. And when you're given that kind of freedom to think, at least it opens the door so you don't have unnecessary struggles like that. I'll really be thankful for that. And what I found is in some cases, people walk away from a version of Christianity which is unnecessarily, what do I say, narrow? By narrow, I simply mean taking a number of secondary issues and treating them as though they're fundamental, that this is Christianity. And when people go to university, study other things, or they go talk to somebody else, they begin to think a little bit differently. They're really given two options. Either accept the version of Christianity we have told you, or you got to leave. At least that's how they feel. And that in my mind is so unnecessary. It kind of drives me nuts when I hear those kinds of stories. And it's sad when it happens. And so I think if there's anything we can do, let's at least open the door for our young people to be able to study and the freedom to think and say, here are the basic few foundations, hang on to these,
Amen,
and then do some good thinking about all the other things.
Amen, Paul. That is a breath of fresh air. Now, Paul, I want to...
Is this James out here? Not James. Okay, no. Okay, I thought that might be my friend James. Okay.
Oh, good. Well, you might have to get some glasses
could be
on there,
wrong.
Paul.
Okay,
you want
okay.
your glasses?
That if I don't say it now, I'm not going to get them later.
I thought you were talking about James the
But
Bible
I'm
writer
only
there.
looking over here. Yeah, James the Just, maybe? Okay.
Okay, church, this is going to be again, I think this is a good concluding for us as a church to finish with this why stop believing. So that was point one. We've created this narrow space. Paul, I want to kind of go and dig this out a little bit as the church, as leaders of the church and as congregants of the church. You know, I was joking with a buddy of mine yesterday. I said, it must be nice to be Paul. You could come into the church and make a comment about, there's questions about Adam and Eve, and then you could go back to Vancouver. If I said something like that, Paul, I get crucified and the emails would come.
We have issues in Vancouver too, just so you know.
Paul.
Okay.
But what I read, you mentioned Francis Collins, right? Francis Collins, science believer. He says that the pastors, the leaders of the church, need to be bold and they need to tackle these tough issues. And they need to talk about it from the front. They can't shy away from it.
Right.
The problem is, as a leader, what happens to you is you get crucified from the church after that. And Francis Collins, I appreciate him because he actually said, churches, we have to support our leaders because they're trying to reach this generation of young people and trying to just create that space.
I hadn't heard him say that.
How do you respond to that, Paul?
Well, I just think that... Oh, you're asking me?
Just like, how do
Go
we...
ahead.
But
It sounded like you were, but then I wasn't sure anymore.
sorry, I'm going on my own. I don't know.
This is Luke Skywalker, by the way. Here.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
I remember a member of the church said to me, Luke, we want to hear your honest opinion, and I didn't give it to them because I was worried about the feedback I was going to get from the congregation.
Right.
But we also want to have space for this. You just said that people are walking away from the church because we prevented a narrow view of Bible in these issues. I really appreciate Colin's book on that because he talked about leaders do need to be bold. You have to be ready for the pushback, but keep fighting because this is the way forward for the church. That doesn't mean we're sacrificing the old belief. We're sticking true to the authority. But how for us as leaders, Paul, how would you challenge us as pastors, but also us as the church, the congregation, to be a church that is not losing people because of the narrowness? Does that make sense, church? You understand where I'm going?
Great question. And interestingly enough, I think that I can learn as much from you folks in your church on this as anything I can say. Pastor Ian and I were talking about this today. We had a good long breakfast. Brian Gehring and Ian and I were I'm not sure how many hours it was, but it was a really great time together. I think this is a real challenge. I think that it's critical if pastoral staff get together, think through if they want to bring in other people to help them talk about these from time to time, but to bone up on certain issues, but begin to, in a very thoughtful way, take issue after issue and formulate what is it that we really need to hang on to? What are our core basic principles that we really need to hang on to if we want to be faithful to the biblical text? And then where do we have some room here? Where do we have some parameters? And then how can we as a church live this out? Like, how can we be welcoming to people who are made in God's image but are far less than perfect? And that's all of us, by the way. But how can we be welcoming to people who are that way at the same time maintaining the integrity of the church in the most foundational way? Like, what are our foundational principles? And then how do we do that? And then we simply have to, the next step, I hope, is have the church leadership on board as much as we possibly can. And then it may just be a matter of some time of stepping forward and saying, this is where we are as a church. We're moving this way. We welcome you and we hope you can stay with us. Sometime you lose the occasional person over that, and that's kind of sad. But I do think it beats the alternative of having the occasional person dictate what the entire church needs to do. I do think it beats that alternative. But if we do this right, maybe we as a Christian community can move through this, because we are actually in an interesting period of transition, not just the Lethbridge Free Church, but the evangelical church across North America and around the world. We're in a really interesting time right now. We're working through a number of fairly difficult issues. And I think 20, 30, 40 years from now, we'll have come through this, and it'll be interesting to see where we end up. But we're in the transitionary time now. I think it requires this kind of thought and guidance by the Holy Spirit as well, a sense of real humility on our part, but carefully latching onto what are the foundational points, and there's probably just a few of those that we need to hang on to. And then where do we have room to have different opinions on matters? And then how can we welcome people in to have a relationship with God? As many people as we possibly can, welcome them in and treat them in a way that is in accordance with biblical truth, which means showing love, showing justice, showing the heart of God. Yeah.
Amen, Paul. I got a couple texts that said I'm in trouble and I got to pack my bags.
Okay. Well, so you might as well stay up here as long as you can then tonight, because this could be your last shot at it, Luke. Okay.
So, Paul, we just did number one, church, if you're following with me, number one, why people stop believing, this narrow sense of, if the Bible contradicts, I'm gone, right? Yeah. And there's probably some fault on the church for that, Paul, and you've challenged us with that. What would be maybe another big thing of why people are walking away? You said the narrow view. What would be another thing that you saw?
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking, well, boy, in addition to that, that's one of the key ones I've ever seen.
Okay.
I don't know that we've always been as welcoming a place as we could be. Now, not every church can be perfect in every one of these ways, but I watched one of my own sons, who's now 31. He's doing just fine. But when he was a younger guy, he learned to play drums, and he got not too bad at it. We were attending a fairly large church, and there was no place for him to play drums. And so, what we did as his parents, we went to another church in town, smaller church, and Anglican church. I knew the youth pastor. I said, "You need a drummer." He said, "Boy, we need a drummer so bad." I said, "Would you like to come give my son a call, take him out for a Coke? Would you like to invite him?" Well, he eventually did, and guess what? My son's an Anglican to this day. That was 15 years ago. He went over there and he fell in love with that group and that church, and he's lived in 2 or 3 different places now, always Anglican all the way. And I just had to realize, okay, our church just wasn't really able to, I don't see how we could have done more than we did. I'm not sure what our church could have done differently. But this other church was able to do that. And I'm glad that they were, because that gave him a really great way to be welcomed in. He felt great there, met a lot of neat people. The youth pastor was top-notch to him, and he gave him a chance to use his drumming, which he did for a number of years there. And now they're sitting in our basement, the drums, okay? So, yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Okay.
Let's thank Paul.
Great.
And Ian.
Okay. Let me just want to thank both Luke and your leadership team here, and Ian as well. I mean, Ian's been such a friend of mine over the years, but it has been just sheer pleasure to be with you folks over the years, and this time especially, been just a really great time together. So thank you all for coming. God bless you, my brother. It's been great, Ian. Okay. Thanks again.
Rich, did you get my text? Okay, good. You're ready to pray. I've asked Rich, he's our chairman, if he would lead us in closing prayer tonight. But just before Rich prays, I plan to say this to you, Paul. On behalf of our congregation, I want to say thank you for giving your life. I think it's your life to this ministry, to equipping people, the church, the body of Christ. This has been a rich time for us, and we really appreciate your willingness to come and share your time with us. But we know that this doesn't come without a whole pile of hours, years of study. And so we are indebted to you and to Gail. And I'm very, very encouraged looking to the future, because we talked about other apologists, future apologists. And you are training some at Trinity, and I believe the future for the church is bright, is encouraging, because there are new young people beginning to think about these, asking questions and answering them as well, because they're being equipped by people like you and the other apologists, many of whom we've had here in our church. So Paul, thank you on behalf of our church for your commitment to the work, to the word, and to the local church. Rich, will you lead us in prayer, and let's stand together and pray.
I had threatened Paul to ask him a question that was totally something he hadn't touched on before earlier, and you touched on it very well. And it comes from the passage in Peter, which is always prepared to have an answer for the hope that you have. Not just for the truth that you have, but for the hope that you have. And you touched on that tonight, that this story is they were willing to die, not just because it was true, but because that was their hope. That the resurrection of Jesus was their hope, and it is ours as well. And I thank you so much for touching on that and for dealing with that well. And that is our hope as a church, as followers of Jesus. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for your love for us, and I thank you for sending Christ to show himself to us, to be your complete revelation to us. Thank you for your word that describes for us to understand 2,000 years later from when he walked on this earth, that his resurrection is our hope. Help us to pass that on to others. Help us to be your church as clear as we can be, to live Christ to our culture today. Help them to understand that. Thank you so much for Paul and his work with us. Thank you for the leadership in Luke in the future, and the young staff that we have in the future of dealing with these questions and having open hands where we need to have open hands, and welcoming arms where we need to have welcoming arms, and a tight fist where we need to have tight fist on the truths that are central to what you have for us. Thank you for the reminder that Paul gave us today. And I pray your blessing on him as he goes back and leads where he is. And I pray your blessing on this church as we journey in our city, in our time, in this, what we're called to do here. In Jesus' name, amen.